As you all know, and as we've talked about over the last couple days, we've gained a lot of ground in 2013. The decade-long wins of our opponents became history when we won at the ballot box in 2012 in Maine, in Washington State, and Maryland. But as such, we've seen in 2013 that individuals we fought battles against here on our own soil for so long, individuals like Brian Brown of the National Organization for Marriage, have been spending more time abroad. When you look at the large protests that sprung up in France during the marriage equality debate, Brian Brown was there, helping with tactics, software, and advice. When the Russia Duma was considering a law that would prevent LGBT individuals from being parents, Brian Brown was there with a delegation of French conservatives talking about why we shouldn't be allowed to have children. There's a growing American industry of Americans exporting hate. And dozens of Americans and dozens of American-based organizations are becoming part of that industry. Through our global engagement program, we're looking to expose, combat, and counter the messages of those folks the same way we've done here. Today, we're honored to be joined by two movement leaders from countries that have seen their fair share of American hate mongers on their soil. First, Dane Lewis, who's joined us from Jamaica, where he's the executive director of the oldest national LGBT organization there, JFLAG, founded in 1998. As well, we have Caleb Orozco, who is from Belize, where he's the executive director of the United Belize Advocacy Movement. Caleb is not only the head of UNIBAM, but he is also the primary plaintiff in the constitutional challenge against Belize's sodomy statute. And as you may have picked up, Dane and Caleb both come to us from the Caribbean, a place that Americans often don't think of as hostile to LGBT people, and also a place that, unfortunately, we're finding anti-LGBT Americans going to do more than vacation. I just want to give a few examples before bringing them up of what some of these Americans are doing. Last summer, our friend Brian Brown, who I've already talked about, spoke at a Caribbean conference in Trinidad and Tobago about what Americans are, how the LGBT community has destroyed the fabric of American society, and why the Caribbean nations should reject same-sex families. And then there's another American, Brian Kamiker, who served at a keynote just last December in Jamaica, where he warned Jamaicans that repealing the country's sodomy law would end free speech as they know it and increase STDs. And then another American, Piero Tazzi, who served as a speaker in a conference in Jamaica in 2011. He claimed many studies that we have in the US show that children are damaged by same-sex parents, and that most LGBT people can be explained because they were abused as children. And then the final person I'm going to tell you about is a Texan. I'm a Texan, so this is especially poignant to me to see that this is happening, but a Texan named Scott Sturm. He's basically taken the rhetoric of our opponents to Belize. He's been there for over a decade, and he's called Caleb's campaign against the sodomy statute a, let's get it right, orchestrated plan of demonic justice. He's also claimed that the gay agenda in Brazil, or at Belize, is about demented sexual practices targeting children. And these are only a couple of folks I just pulled out to share with you. They're only representative of what's going on in the region and also around the world. So I'm going to welcome up a friend, Ahmed Shihab-Eldin, who's going to moderate a panel with Caleb and Dane about their work as LGBT advocates in Jamaica and Belize. Ahmed you may know from Huffington Post Live, where he's a producer and host, or previously from his work at Al Jazeera's The Stream, where he both launched, produced, and hosted that show. We're lucky to have him here. We're excited to bring him up. So everybody give a round of applause for Ahmed, Dane, and Caleb.
Hello. I'd like to start by saying how honored I am to be here. Truly honored, and also honored to facilitate this really important conversation. And if I may, I also want to start by saying I'm an Arab American. I've lived around the world, grew up in Egypt, in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and I think that has meant that I know all too well the collective struggle that unites so many of us, the struggle to live a life of dignity, the struggle to have our human rights respected around the world, and particularly our right to love and our right to live. So with that in mind, I'd like to start, because I have so many questions for you, and we have a limited amount of time. Dane, your predecessor at JFLAG had to seek asylum in Canada. You started as a volunteer. You were reluctant at first to be public in your advocacy and in your work. What has that been like, and how did that affect now your very public role and decision to take this role?
Well, being gay in Jamaica comes with its own challenges, but being an advocate for a gay movement, I think just increases those risks for potential to violence. My main reservations were for my family, my personal protection, and also for my family. But you know, also being out there and representing in a very public way the issues was one of the reasons why my predecessor had to leave. And so, in fact, my work and being the face of the movement, I literally didn't come out as the face until January 2013. We started a campaign called We Are Jamaicans. It's on our YouTube page. You can go have a look at it. And interestingly, 2 weeks after that, someone left a note etched in the dust on my windshield, parked in front of my house. The usual slogan, Batman for dead. And I thought, why not? I've lived here for about 5 years. And then it was like, oh, stupid Dane, you just put your face out there. So it's really, you know, it's also caused me to adjust how I move about my regular day. Just because you never know.
What does that actually mean on the day-to-day for you?
As we were talking earlier, I try not to live in fear. So I am mindful. I'm trying not to look over my shoulder, you know, wherever I am. In fact, my partner reminds me when we go to the supermarket sometimes, don't you hear what they're saying? You know, people will throw comments. In fact, I've recognized that the comments that I do get that I'm most receptive to clearly are those that are positive, and the persons who have been brave enough to come up to me, thankfully, have all been positive comments. But people do pass remarks. I remember going to a regular market downtown. I used to go on a Saturday morning regularly with my neighbor, and I had to stop doing that because one morning I entered the market and there was this lady making some derogatory comment. I thought, well, you know, I don't want to risk my own safety and my neighbor's safety.
And of course, risk plays such a big role in the work that you do. And Caleb, I would imagine that you can relate to this. It's worth mentioning, I think it's been mentioned tonight, or today, 11 countries in the Caribbean, in fact, criminalize same-sex relations. We heard 80, I believe, around the world earlier. You, though, are personally trying to challenge this in Belize, specifically the criminalization statute. Could you tell us what it's like for you personally, but also professionally, being at the center of this effort to decriminalize this?
First, I'd like to say that I am not a victim of discrimination, but a survivor. Now, doing this comes with a cost. And some of the costs, a few hours before 2014, my neighbor decides he would stone my window. That was another incident. I've had my car broken into, things stolen, lots of e-threats, and I hate cars, but I learned to drive at the age of 39. Why? Because one of my good old ex-classmates decides to write on Facebook, the way you solve the Supreme Court challenge is if Caleb should die. So after that, I decided to drive to my conference. But then I forgot the damn computer I was supposed to take to do the presentation with, and I had to return back to traffic, blah, 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 blah. So there have been about 4,000 people who have marched against UNIBAM. They have been doing UNIBAM effigy. One of the most interesting things is lots of people know me, but very few people are my friends. And so the most interesting turning point has been after my brother's brain surgery. He came to me and he said, "You might not worry what you might go through, but think about how we would feel if something happened to you." And that's when I decided to be less, what's the word, dogmatic and more conscious of my safety issues. So those are the issues.
And hopefully we can touch back on what that actually means. But in the spirit of time, you know, obviously last summer we heard about Dwayne Johnson, murdered in Jamaica. The murder made international news, and I know that you found your face locally or domestically in the papers. Could you tell us about the incident specifically, what shocked you most about it, and why it is a powerful deterrent when they threaten your family, if not the individual?
Yeah, last July, Dwayne Jones, a cross-dressing teen, went out with two of his friends. They were all dressed up. They just wanted to go out and have a good time. He'd been homeless for about 2 years and, you know, had made this group of friends. So they went out to a street dance, all dressed up. A street dance which would have had about between 200 and 300 people present. There were questions about his gender identity, and so he sort of moved away from the crowd. A few of the people followed him. He ended up being stabbed, shot 3 times, run over by a car, left to die on the side of the road. Nobody came to pick him up until the police came. And for me, that was, I think, the greatest issue with the whole scenario, that no one seemed to have stopped or attempted to stop him from being killed. You know, that someone could take his life just because he wanted to go to a party.
And what, in your mind, knowing the culture and knowing the society there, what in your mind is the strongest force that permits or encourages people to not speak up or not do anything when they find themselves in a situation where they're observing such a horror take place?
Well, we have a disease in Jamaica. It's called guilty by association. So if I stand up for you, we had the same issue around HIV. We had to, I mean, that took decades, and we still have a huge stigma. It's even hard for straight men to go and access HIV/AIDS services just because of the stigma around HIV. So, you know, you can imagine someone wanting to react, but so, you know, but it's still appalling that they could stand by and let them murder this young man.
And what role do American evangelical groups or other groups who are coming to the country and have been for quite some time play in this? What is the connection that they make on the ground that allows this kind of mentality to exist?
Well, one of the damaging things is that they come and they rile up the church groups, because we live in a Judeo-Christian society. And so they get people into this moral tizzy, you know, this frenzy, because apparently the next day we're going to want to get married, and then we're going to want to adopt their kids and apparently sleep with their goats. Because, you know, they keep lumping all of those things together. And so, you know, and what's quite interesting, although a lot of Jamaicans feel that something needs to be done, they just don't have a clue what the logical steps could be. So, you know, they latch on to this anxiety about gay marriage and just get people riled up. And they've been mobilizing a lot of young people now, and sadly a lot of young people who are questioning their sexuality, guilting them into turning their life over to Jesus, et cetera, et cetera.
You know, what's so interesting, you said they're I don't know if you use the word targeting young people, but they're approaching or talking to young people. And that's often you know, whether it's in Russia or where have you, that's often what we hear. We would like to protect our youth, and yet those very same people on the other side of this debate are approaching the youth because perhaps they know that they can convince them of these things. The reason I bring this up, Caleb, you know, we heard briefly about Scott Sturm from Texas. I don't know how long he's actually been it's almost 20 years now, right, that he's been going to Belize?
Well, he's my good friend, but I usually refer to him as Scott Sperm. Sorry, Sperm. No, Sturm. And see, I get that confused. Sorry.
I mean, earlier when Ty was speaking, you know, there was not laughter, but there was a reaction in the crowd when the word demonic, I believe that's the word, correct, was used, because it seems so absurd that it is almost laughable. But of course, the reality on the ground is not a laughing matter. And with that in mind, I mean, you know, he calls you demonic. I know that there have been effigies of you and you know, all these sorts of things, and yet he talks about himself as saying he's protecting human dignity. What can you tell us about Scott and why his work is effective, if it is effective?
Well, what they're doing is advancing the 7 pillars of dominionism, which is the belief that Christians can control government, business, religion, education, health, so on and so on. And they have a platform, and that platform is a media house called Plus TV. Why it's effective is because they use legitimate spaces. So if you're doing medical services, scholarships, serving the poor, those are legitimate spaces. And so the issues get clouded because they don't realize the controlling effect of what's going on. The Scott's term, in my mind, has no integrity because at one point he said at a presentation that the ACLU was trying to allow gay porn into a high school. I believe it's a case in Colorado. I believed it. And then we checked. It was to filter out LGBT supportive materials into the school, which is totally different. When I called him on it, he said, nothing, neither denying nor otherwise. That's an example. Another example is this whole idea of a foreign agenda. Originally, we had no counter to that until we realized that they were working with CFAM, they were working with Alliance Defending Freedom, until we realized that Alliance Defending Freedom had a budget of $65,000 operating within the region. And so these are things that we had to find out on our own before we could respond.
And when you talk about Alliance Defending Freedom, obviously there are some misconceptions as to what they actually do, both, I would imagine, in Belize and around the world. Their tax returns show that the dollars are going to defend human rights. Why do you think Americans are playing such a critical, or I should say, pivotal role in this debate when it comes to Belize? Why do the people of Belize think this is happening?
First of all, you have to recognize that no environment is intolerant until it's poisoned. Recently, the US UNAIDS did a report, a study, which found 68% of our people tolerant. But I know from my research with Jamaica was also tolerant. And so my job is to prevent the erosion of intolerance. And it's 3 of me doing it, taking the helm and putting out the rest. But to answer your question, people don't question religion or religious leaders. People don't think deeper than what they're told. And because there's a system, I live in a system where civil society is weak, and the human rights infrastructure, the mechanism is weak or almost non-existent in supporting LGBT issues, then you have a catch-22 of who do you report to when you experience a crime? Who do you report to when you experience discrimination? And at the same time, do you take the risk to do any reports?
And is there also the added pressure of when a crime occurs, aside from the government handling it properly, the media obviously plays a role both here and there, and in Belize, is it true that there's a reluctance to report on some of these things because of the families not wanting to either disrespect the families, or perhaps families don't want their reputation tarnished? Because in the Arab world, where I'm from, I would imagine this is one of the biggest barriers.
Well, I can tell you personally, after my 2 teeth was knocked out, I didn't want to go report to the police, and I'm the damn advocate. For my director, who was stabbed about 15 times several years ago, he didn't want to report because of those exact reasons, and I didn't even know.
Caleb, sorry, but go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to say in the instance of Dwayne Jones, his own family didn't want to claim his dead body. That I mean, speaks volumes. In fact, it was an aunt who quietly went and claimed that we reached out to say, do you need any support? And they're like, they didn't want to divulge any information just because there was so much media hype about it.
And Caleb, is this about a fear of retribution, or is this about a fear of what the family's reputation might be?
It's a little of both, but you have to recognize that the state does not promote confidence in access to justice. There is no human rights agenda. There's no human rights investment. There's human rights investment on paper. And so my job is to challenge them to transform the paper commitment into action. We have a discussion right now on the development of a national human rights institution, for which I was talking to regional agencies about. But I was told that the state has to lead that, but right now the state has put a freeze on even developing a feasibility study, for which they accepted in the UPR report of 2009 in Geneva.
And Dane, Jamaica has been called, I mean, it has one of the highest murder rates in the world. Some people may not know that. It's also been called the most homophobic country in the world, I think in 2006, but it continues to be occasionally to this day. JFLAG's made progress. When you talk about the culture itself, you know, even in Belize, you were talking about intolerance and tolerance. There are people who say, sure, these countries may have always been unfriendly towards gays or people who stray from the norm, if you will, whatever norm it is they're referring to. And it wasn't until some of these evangelical groups and others from the West were coming in with the propaganda about the youth and, you know, fear-mongering that things took a turn for the worse. And that even some of the laws criminalizing same-sex relationships come from colonial pasts. But what do you think it is that drives the homophobic culture? Is it exclusively these groups?
Well, so for us, it's three pillars. There is the church, there's this archaic legislation, and then there's our pop culture, dancehall music, which unfortunately, as you may have seen, oftentimes, because the artists come from a fundamentalist Christian background, they quote Leviticus, a man who lies with a man shall be put to death. And so that's the framework that they respond. And oftentimes I think they're responding to the pressure of not being guilty by association if they don't have at least one song in their repertoire that speaks out against homosexuality, then they could possibly be labeled by their colleagues. It's interesting because you'd imagine that possibly amongst those who are more educated and exposed that, you know, they wouldn't act out violently. But in 2011, November 2011, there was a young man who was alleged to have been caught in a bathroom with another man. We haven't seen the other guy yet. But he fled from the crowd, went to a security post at the university, and then it was a security officer who he went to protection from that turned around and beat him. Yeah. So, you know, in the spaces, and I mean, there was a huge mob outside. There are tons of videos on YouTube just of the mobs gathering, you know, hand him out to us, hand him out to us. So you'd think even in those spaces where there's opportunity for higher learning and exposure, that people would respond differently, but not so.
And when there's a lack of recourse or not knowing who to turn to, I would imagine some people turn to you.
Yeah, we get on average about 60 incidents reported a year, varying issues, people being kicked out of homes, being mob attacks.
Are you overwhelmed?
Yeah, we don't have enough staff to adequately deal with and support each case. And that's been a huge challenge. The reality is, though, that even those numbers are low. A lot of people, they don't see the value in coming forward to report, so they don't report to us. Right. They know they're not going to get any real response from the police, so they don't go to the police to report. So, you know, we really are stuck. We've been really trying to encourage people to report, and thankfully over the last year, we've seen an increase in the number of persons being comfortable to come forward to report. But to what end? Again, you know, we have an under-resourced police force, so it creates challenges.
And you talk about being short-staffed. Caleb coming to you, I mean, there's one LGBT organization in Belize, correct?
Absolutely.
It has 2 employees.
2 employees.
You're one of them.
I'm 1.5 of them.
1.5 of them. The other half your hair?
That's right, he clarifies.
Why take on this responsibility?
I ask myself that, and I can joke sometime, maybe I'm crazy, but I had to go through a self-realization process. And what I realized is I was being insulted and ridiculed and threatened for doing nothing. So I decided that if I'm going to go through that, you're going to do that because I'm doing something. And also because I'm... And also my mom calls me a pig-headed stubborn mule, so that helps too.
Well, I could sit here and talk about this forever, but I do want to thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your stories and your thoughts with us. And if I may also say, I have a lot of friends in Lebanon, since this is a global conversation, and just a week or 2 ago it was officially announced that even in the Arab world, which of course we have our own ideas of how backwards or how long progress is there, but the reason I started this, how far away we are, I started this by saying collectively we share this struggle. I was so thrilled to see just a small step in the decriminalization of same-sex relationships now in Lebanon, an Arab country. So perhaps that's a step in the right direction. And it's because of people like you, so thank you very much.